They called him the Shadow King of the city. George M. Posh wasn't simply a crime boss. He was a gravitational force. A man who ruled with whispers because his dog screamed for him. And that dog never left his side. The ghost, they named it. Breed unknown. Size terrifying. Weight somewhere north of 160 pounds. A creature so volatile that even Posh's own lieutenants kept their hands visible and their movements slow when it entered a room. Rival families cancelled meetings if they heard the ghost was coming. Police departments filed incident reports just for proximity. Nobody approached George M. Posh within arm's reach without written permission and a prayer. Until one desperate night, a waitress drowning in debt named Lisa C. Cologne did what trained handlers, federal agents, and hardened criminals swore was suicide. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She did something that froze the trigger fingers of every killer in the obsidian room and shattered every assumption about who truly controlled the beast. This is the story of how a broken woman tamed the untamable and caught the eye of the predator who thought he owned it. The obsidian room wasn't just a nightclub. It was a throne room for the city's most lethal congregation. Black marble columns rose like sentinels. The champagne cost more than bail money, and the air perpetually carried the copper taste of old violence and fresh threats. Lisa C. Cologne adjusted her serving tray, her hands steady despite the tremor living beneath her skin. It was her third shift this week at this particular hell. She needed this job like a drowning person needs shore. Her father's debt sat in her mind like an executioner's countdown. $50,000 to a loan shark whose patience had run out months ago. The tips from her morning shifts at the diner weren't even touching the interest. Here, one good night could buy her another month of breathing room. Private table 9. Dimitri, the floor manager, murmured in her ear. His voice carried the weight of a warning. And Lisa, whatever you do, don't make eye contact with the dog. He didn't need to specify whose table. The entire club seemed to dim its lights and lower its volume whenever George M. Posh occupied the space. He was the architect of the city's criminal infrastructure. A man whose reputation arrived before he did. Like smoke before fire. Sharp features, eyes dark as obsidian. A tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Lisa's yearly rent. His presence didn't request attention. It commandeered it. But it wasn't George that made career criminals check their exits. It was the shadow pressed against the booth. The ghost was a nightmare given form. Massive and muscular, with a coat the color of burnt umber and battle scars that mapped a history of violence. The dog wore a reinforced collar embedded with what looked like surgical steel, but no leash. No muzzle. No chain. George M. Posh didn't need restraints. His control was absolute. Or so the city believed. Please, if you are listening, stories like this aren't just about power. They're about the choices behind it. If this one pulled you in, please subscribe and stay with the channel. More stories like this are coming. They called him the Shadow King of the city. George M. Posh wasn't simply a crime boss. He was a gravitational force. A man who ruled with whispers because his dog screamed for him. And that dog never left his side. The ghost, they named it. Breed unknown. Size terrifying. Weight somewhere north of 160 pounds. A creature so volatile that even Posh's own lieutenants kept their hands visible and their movements slow when it entered a room. Rival families cancelled meetings if they heard the ghost was coming. Police departments filed incident reports just for proximity. Nobody approached George M. Posh within arm's reach without written permission and a prayer. The obsidian room sat at the heart of Posh's empire like a black jewel. It wasn't just a nightclub. It was a courthouse where verdicts were whispered over bourbon and bodies were disposed of before the ice melted. The main floor stretched beneath crystal chandeliers that cast fractured light across black marble, creating shadows that moved like living things. Velvet booths lined the walls, each one a confessional booth for sins that would never see daylight. But booth 9, the corner throne elevated 3 steps above the main floor, belonged to only one man. George M. Posh sat there now, his presence warping the atmosphere like heat distortion. He was in his late 40s, lean and coiled, with the kind of face that photographers would call aristocratic and undertakers would call efficient. His hair, steel gray at the temples, was slicked back with surgical precision. The charcoal suit he wore had been tailored by hands that understood violence needed elegant packaging. A platinum watch caught the light at his wrist, its face worth more than most people's cars. But it was his eyes that made grown men recalculate their life choices. Dark. Depthless. The kind of eyes that saw through excuses straight to the mathematics of consequence. He lifted a glass of Macallan, single malt that cost $400 a pour, and took a measured sip. The gesture was theatrical. Controlled. Everything George M. Posh did was a performance of absolute dominion. Beside him, pressed against the booth's leather like a coiled spring, the ghost lay in that particular stillness that predators possessed. The dog's massive head rested on paws thick as a man's forearm, but its eyes remained open, alert, scanning the room with mechanical precision. The ghost's coat was the color of burnt bronze, mottled with darker patches that might have been natural or might have been old blood no amount of washing could erase. Scars crisscrossed its muzzle and shoulders, each one a story whispered in back alleys and rival territories. The collar around its neck was reinforced leather embedded with steel plates, more armor than accessory. No leash. No chain. No muzzle. George didn't need mechanical restraints. His control was absolute, forged through methods nobody asked about and everyone feared. When he leaned forward to set his glass down, the ghost's head lifted precisely 2 inches, tracking the movement. When a waiter approached with fresh drinks, the dog's lips peeled back just enough to show teeth that had definitely tasted human bone. The waiter's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the tray. George smiled. Steady now. The ghost settled. The waiter survived. The room exhaled collectively. This was the Obsidian Throne. This was power in its purest form. A man who commanded monsters and the monster that obeyed him. Until tonight, no one had ever questioned which one was truly in control. It started with a sound that didn't belong. Not a growl. Nothing as natural as that. This was mechanical guttural, a sound that came from somewhere deep in the ghost's chest like gears grinding against bone. The dog's head snapped up with unnatural speed, and the entire room felt it. The shift in atmospheric pressure. The sudden thinning of oxygen. George's hand froze halfway to his glass. The ghost's eyes were wrong. The warm amber had bled away, replaced by something that glowed crimson in the low light. Not metaphorical. Not imagined. Red. Like brake lights through fog. Like warning signals in the dark. Ghost. George's voice carried the weight of 1,000 commands, but for the first time in recorded history, the dog didn't acknowledge him. The ghost rose from its position with the fluid terror of a predator shedding domestication. Its lips peeled back past teeth, past gums, exposing weaponry that nature had designed for one purpose. The sound that came from its throat now was a shriek. Feral. Unhinged. The kind of noise that bypassed the thinking brain and went straight to the spine's ancient memory of being prey. A champagne flute shattered. Someone screamed. The ghost lunged. Not at a person. At everything. At the air itself. The massive body launched forward, and Booth 9 exploded into chaos. The table flipped, $400 bourbon splashing across marble like blood. Crystal shattered. George rolled backward, his suit jacket tearing as he hit the floor. Gun! Someone shouted. 3 of Posh's men materialized from the shadows, weapons drawn, safeties clicking off with practiced synchronization. But the ghost was already moving, a bronze blur of muscle and madness that physics said shouldn't be possible. It hit the main floor and kept going, jaws snapping at phantoms, claws shredding velvet upholstery like tissue paper. Patrons scattered. A woman in a $1,000 dress dove behind the bar. A man in his 60s, probably responsible for a dozen murders himself, climbed onto a table like a child fleeing a spider. The ghost's eyes tracked movement with predatory precision, but there was nothing calculated in it now. This wasn't hunting. This was a system failure. Neural meltdown. The dog spun, snarling at a chandelier, then at its own shadow, then at a chair that had the audacity to exist. Take the shot. Dmitri screamed from somewhere near the kitchen. But the ghost was too fast. Too unpredictable. The men with guns tracked the animal's movement, fingers on triggers, but in a room full of Posh's elite clientele, A missed shot meant bodies and consequences. George pushed himself upright, blood trailing from his temple where he'd hit the floor. His face was a mask of something nobody had seen before. Not fear. Something colder. Something closer to recognition. "Don't," he said, but his voice lacked its usual gravity. The ghost planted itself in the center of the room, muscles coiled, drool streaming from jaws that worked mechanically. Its red eyes swept across the frozen tableau of terrified criminals and drawn weapons. And then it saw her. The waitress. The one who'd been assigned booth 9. Lisa C. Cologne stood 20 feet away, her tray still balanced in one hand, her body absolutely motionless. The ghost's crimson gaze locked onto her like a missile finding its target. Everything stopped breathing. Lisa C. Cologne did 3 things that should have gotten her killed. First, she dropped the tray. The crash of crystal and porcelain hitting marble should have triggered the ghost's attack reflex. Instead, the sound seemed to fracture time itself, creating a pocket of stillness in the chaos. Second, she didn't run. Every survival instinct coded into human DNA screamed for flight. Every person in that room had chosen escape. But Lisa's feet stayed planted, her body assuming a posture that wasn't quite surrender and wasn't quite challenging. Something in between. Something older than language. Third, she made eye contact. Direct. Unwavering. Locking onto those crimson pupils that had made grown killers climb furniture. The ghost's haunches coiled. Its weight shifted forward. Tzzt. The sound came from Lisa's throat, sharp and guttural, a syllable that belonged to no human language. Not a word. A frequency. A command buried so deep in canine neurology that evolution itself recognized it. The ghost's head tilted. Just 1 degree. But in that micro-movement, the world recalibrated. Tzzt. Lisa's voice carried harmonics that shouldn't exist in human vocal cords. Her right hand came up slowly, palm flat, fingers spread in a precise configuration. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Geometric. Mathematical. The ghost's red eyes flickered. Something behind the crimson struggled to surface. "What the hell is she doing?" one of the gunmen whispered. George M. Posh said nothing. His dark eyes tracked between the waitress and his dog with the focus of a man watching his entire empire pivot on a moment he couldn't control. Lisa took 1 step forward. The room inhaled sharply. Guns tracked her movement, but nobody fired. They were too mesmerized by what they were witnessing. This small woman, exhausted and underpaid, walked toward certain death with the confidence of someone who'd done it before. Tzzt. The third sound was lower, resonant, vibrating at a frequency that seemed to bypass the air and go straight into bone. Her hand rotated 90 degrees, then locked. Her eyes never blinked. Never wavered. The connection between her pupils and the ghost's was a physical thing now, a tether made of pure neurological override. The ghost's muscles trembled. Its jaws worked, strings of saliva breaking against marble. But it didn't lunge. Didn't move. The red in its eyes flickered like dying neon, amber bleeding back in around the edges. Lisa took another step. Then another. She was close enough now that the ghost's breath misted her white serving shirt. Close enough that one snap of those jaws would crush her windpipe before anyone could intervene. She placed her hand on the ghost's massive skull. The room heard the impossible. A sound that didn't belong in this moment, in this place, in this reality. The ghost whimpered. Not a growl. Not a snarl. A whimper. Soft and broken and utterly canine. The red drained completely from its eyes, replaced by something worse than rage. Confusion. Pain. Fear. The animal collapsed. Not fell. Collapsed. Its legs folded, its bulk hitting the floor with a thud that shook chandeliers. It pressed its head against Lisa's thigh like a creature seeking sanctuary. Silence. Absolute. Suffocating. Lisa's hand stayed on the ghost's head, her fingers finding pressure points that had names only veterinary neurologists knew. Her breathing was controlled. Professional. The breathing of someone who'd performed this exact intervention before, under circumstances nobody in this room could imagine. George M. Posh rose to his full height, blood still trailing down his temple, his suit destroyed, his empire watching. He stared at Lisa C. Cologne like she was an equation he'd been trying to solve his entire life. "Who?" he said quietly. "The hell are you?" George M. Posh's private office existed in a different reality than the Obsidian Room. Here, the chaos was controlled. Organized. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a city that didn't know it was owned. Abstract art worth more than small countries hung on walls the color of charcoal. The desk was mahogany and steel, built like a fortress. Lisa sat across from him, still wearing her waitress uniform, still smelling faintly of spilled bourbon and terror. The ghost lay between them, its massive head resting on her foot. Not George's. Hers. That detail wasn't lost on either of them. "Lisa C. Cologne," George said, reading from a file that had materialized within 20 minutes of their arrival. Age 32. Former lead canine behavioral specialist at the Apex Canine Rehabilitation Institute. Worked with military contractors, police departments, and private security firms. Specialized in extreme aggression cases and neurological disorders in working dogs. He looked up. "Until 3 years ago, when you were fired for allegedly falsifying treatment records during a high-profile case involving a senator's guard dog." Lisa's jaw tightened. "I didn't falsify anything. The dog had a brain tumor. I recommended euthanasia. The senator wanted a cover-up, wanted me to say it was behavioral so his insurance would pay for indefinite treatment. When I refused, he destroyed my career." "So you became a waitress," George said. No judgment in his voice. Just observation. "I became whatever paid my father's debt," Lisa corrected. $50,000 to a loan shark with a very specific timeline. "I had 3 months. I'm now in month 4. George leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The gesture was theatrical. Everything about George was theater. "And do you know who holds your father's debt?" Something cold moved through Lisa's chest. "A company called Obsidian Holdings." "My company," George said softly. "I've owned your father's debt for 6 months. I bought it from the original shark for 70 cents on the dollar." "Do you know why?" Lisa said nothing. The ghost's breathing was steady against her ankle. "Because I'd been looking for you," George continued. "When the ghost started showing irregularities 2 months ago, I had my people research every canine specialist in the region. Your name came up. Your credentials were impeccable. But you'd vanished. Became invisible. Until I found the debt and realized I could bring you to me." The words landed like physical blows. "You orchestrated this." "All of it." "Not all of it," George said, standing. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. "I didn't poison my own dog. I didn't trigger tonight's episode. But I did create the conditions that would put you in that room when it happened. Call it strategic positioning." "You're a monster," Lisa said quietly. "Yes," George agreed without turning around. "But I'm a monster who needs you. The ghost is my credibility. My deterrent. My reputation made manifest. Without it, I'm just another aging criminal waiting for someone younger to put a bullet in my skull. Tonight proved I can't control it anymore. But you can." He turned to face her. "So here's my offer. You work for me. Full-time. You rehabilitate the ghost. You figure out what's causing these episodes and you fix it. In exchange, I forgive your father's debt. All of it. And I pay you $5,000 a week." Lisa's breath caught. $5,000 a week was more than she made in 3 months of double shifts. "And if I refuse?" George's smile was glacial. "Then your father's debt comes due in full. Tomorrow. And you know what happens to people who can't pay me." The ghost shifted, pressing harder against Lisa's leg. Even unconscious of the gesture, the animal was choosing her. Protecting her. "I need to examine the ghost properly," Lisa said. "Blood work. Neural scans. Full behavioral history. If someone's doing this deliberately, there will be evidence." "You'll have everything you need," George said. "Top-tier veterinary facilities. Unlimited budget. Whatever it takes. Lisa looked down at the ghost. The animal's eyes were closed now, its breathing deep and even. Trusting. It had been tortured into madness, weaponized by its own neurological breakdown, and yet it had chosen to collapse against her. To seek shelter in her presence. She thought about her father. About 3 years of running from a destroyed reputation. About debt that multiplied like cancer. She thought about the senator's dog, the brain tumor she'd found, the career she'd lost for refusing to lie. And she thought about George M. Posh, who'd orchestrated her entire life for the past 6 months just to position her in the right room at the right time. "I want access to your security team," she said. "Personnel files. Surveillance footage. Anyone who's had contact with the ghost in the past 3 months." George's expression shifted. "Respect, maybe. Or recognition. You think this is an inside job?" "I know animal neurology," Lisa said. "This wasn't random. This was precise. Triggered. Someone with access and knowledge did this deliberately. And I'm going to find out who." George extended his hand. "Then we have a deal." Lisa stood. The ghost rose with her, pressing against her side. She took George's hand. His grip was meant to intimidate. Hers refused to yield. "One more thing," she said. "When I find whoever did this, they're mine to handle." George smiled. "You're going to fit in perfectly here." Lisa C. Cologne had walked into the obsidian room to escape debt. She walked out of George Posh's office as the woman hunting a saboteur in a world where mercy was currency and violence was language. The ghost walked beside her. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. The veterinary lab results arrived at 3 a.m. in a manila envelope so thick it felt like evidence at a murder trial. Lisa sat in the ghost's climate-controlled kennel, the massive dog sleeping fitfully beside her. Its breathing still irregular even 48 hours after the incident. She'd insisted on the blood work. "I demanded it." George had made one phone call, and suddenly she had access to testing facilities that legitimate hospitals couldn't afford. She opened the envelope. I started reading. Stopped breathing. Tetramethylene disulfatotramine. The technical name sat on the page like a confession. AS for short. A neurotoxin so banned in so many countries that possessing it carried federal terrorism charges. It didn't kill quickly. It accumulated. Built up in neural pathways like rust in pipes, corroding the connection between brain and body until the victim became a weapon against itself. The ghost hadn't gone feral. It had been systematically poisoned. Lisa's hands shook as she cross-referenced the metabolite breakdown. The exposure pattern was consistent. Daily. Small doses. Administered with professional precision to avoid acute symptoms until the threshold hit and the dog's neurological system detonated like a timed explosive. Someone had been feeding the ghost poison for weeks. She found George in his office at dawn, the city bleeding orange light through floor-to-ceiling windows. He sat behind a desk that probably cost more than her father's debt, reading reports with the focus of a man who made life-and-death decisions before breakfast. "It's TS," she said without preamble, dropping the lab results on his desk. "Highly regulated neurotoxin. The ghost has been ingesting it regularly, probably in its food." George's eyes went from the papers to her face. Something dark moved behind his expression. "How regularly?" "Every day for at least 3 weeks. Maybe longer. The build-up is cumulative. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't street level. This is someone with access to chemical weapons and knowledge of canine neurology." "And proximity," George said quietly. "Someone close enough to dose the ghost daily without raising suspicion." The implication hung between them like a blade. Lisa pulled out her phone, called up the notes she'd been compiling since the lab results arrived. "The ghost's meals are prepared by your kitchen staff, but only 3 people have clearance to actually feed him. Your head chef, your kennel master, and Marcus Volkov," George finished. "Head of security." The name landed like a headstone. Marcus Volkov had been with George for 7 years. Former Spetsnaz. The kind of man who could disappear problems and make it look like coincidence. He had access to everything. Authority over everyone. and the tactical knowledge to acquire military-grade neurotoxins. He's been working the night shift rotation personally, Lisa said, pulling up security logs on her phone. Every night for the past month. Highly unusual for someone at his level. And look at this. She swiped to another screen. The ghost's feeding schedule was changed 4 weeks ago. Moved from morning to evening. Who authorized that? George's jaw tightened. Marcus did. Said it would improve the ghost's alertness during high-risk evening operations. It improved something, Lisa said coldly. It gave him private access when your regular kennel staff wasn't around. Fewer witnesses. Consistent opportunity. Classic operational security for slow-acting sabotage. George stood, his movements carrying the controlled violence of a man calculating lethal equations. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking down at a city that feared him. When he spoke, his voice carried the temperature of absolute zero. Marcus has a meeting with the Kozlov family scheduled for tonight. Neutral ground. Peace negotiations. He turned to face her. The rival family that's been pushing into my territory for 6 months. Lisa felt the pieces lock into place. He wasn't trying to kill the ghost. He was programming it. Building up the toxin to trigger an episode at a strategic moment. An episode that would make me look weak, George said. Vulnerable. A man who can't even control his own dog can't control his empire. Or an episode that would get you killed, Lisa added. If the ghost went feral during a high-stakes meeting, the chaos would provide perfect cover for an assassination. George smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Lisa had ever seen. Then tonight, he said, we give Marcus exactly what he wants. We bring the ghost to the meeting. And we see who really loses control. The warehouse on the waterfront had been neutral territory for 20 years. Concrete floors, steel beams, and enough empty space that everyone could see everyone else's hands. No ambushes. No surprises. Just words and the men who spoke them. Until tonight. George entered with his usual entourage. 4 men, expensive suits, visible weapons, and the ghost, walking beside him with that mechanical precision that made people forget it was an animal. Lisa followed 3 steps behind, dressed in black tactical gear that Marcus had provided without question. She was the handler now. George's newest acquisition. Nobody questioned it. The Kozlov family waited on the opposite side of the warehouse. Viktor Kozlov himself, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, flanked by his own soldiers. And Marcus Volkov stood slightly apart, positioned exactly where someone would stand if they needed a clear line of sight to multiple exits. Gentlemen, George said, his voice echoing off steel. Shall we discuss terms? Lisa's hand rested on the ghost's collar, feeling the animal's pulse through her fingertips. Steady. Come. The neurotoxin was clearing its system, but the neural pathways were still damaged. Still vulnerable. She'd warned George. He'd smiled that terrible smile and told her to trust him. The negotiations began. Territory. Revenue splits. The usual chess game played with human lives as pieces. Lisa tuned it out, focusing on the ghost, on the microtremors in its muscles, on the way its ears tracked sound she couldn't hear. Then she felt it. A pressure change. Not in the air. In her sinuses. Behind her eyes. A frequency just below the threshold of conscious hearing but high enough to vibrate bone. The ghost's head snapped up. Now, Viktor Kozlov said quietly. The sound intensified. Not louder. Sharper. Lisa's teeth ached. Her vision blurred at the edges. And the ghost's eyes began to change, amber bleeding toward that terrible crimson. Marcus reached into his jacket. Not for a gun. For something smaller. A remote. His thumb moved toward the button, and Lisa understood with crystalline clarity. The neurotoxin had been preparation. This was the trigger. A sonic frequency calibrated to the ghost's compromised neural system, designed to override every behavioral control and turn the animal into a berserker. The ghost's lips peeled back. That mechanical shriek started building in its chest. Marcus! George's voice cut through the frequency like a blade. But Marcus was already pressing the button. The sound that erupted from hidden speakers wasn't audible to human ears, but Lisa felt it in her bones. The ghost convulsed, muscles locking, then releasing. Its eyes went full crimson in seconds. Not gradually. Instantly. Guns came out. Everyone. Kozlov's men. George's men. The warehouse transformed into a Mexican standoff with a neurologically compromised animal at its center. The ghost turned toward George. Its creator. Its master. The man it had protected for years. And Lisa saw the terrible beauty of the trap. They hadn't wanted to kill George with bullets. They'd wanted to destroy him with his own weapon. Make him watch his most loyal guardian tear him apart while his empire witnessed his failure. The ghost lunged. Lisa moved faster. She dropped to her knees, sliding between the animal and George, her hands coming up in that geometric configuration. But this time the vocalization wouldn't be enough. The sonic frequency was overriding everything, turning the ghost's brain into static. She needed to get to the speakers. Needed to kill the frequency. But the ghost was 3 feet away and accelerating, jaws open, red eyes locked on target. Behind her, she heard George's voice, calm as death itself. Lisa! Duck! She dropped flat. The gunshot was deafening. But it wasn't aimed at the ghost. Marcus Volkov's remote exploded in his hand, the device shattering into electronic shrapnel. The sonic frequency died instantly, cutting off like severed power. The ghost stumbled, momentum carrying it forward, but the red was already draining from its eyes. Confusion replaced rage. It landed beside Lisa, panting, shaking, but not attacking. George's gun stayed leveled. Not at the ghost. At Viktor Kozlov. I believe, George said softly, we're done negotiating. The warehouse erupted into violence, but Lisa was already moving, her body covering the ghosts, protecting the animal that had been weaponized against the only person who'd ever truly commanded it. In the chaos of gunfire and screaming, she heard the ghost whimper against her chest. And she made her decision. The warehouse fell silent in the way that only comes after violence. Bodies on concrete. Smoke in the air. The metallic taste of spent ammunition and spilled blood. Viktor Kozlov's men were dead or fleeing. George's soldiers stood in a perimeter, weapons still raised, waiting for the next threat. Marcus Volkov knelt in the center of the floor, his right hand destroyed by George's shot, his left pressed against the ground for balance. Blood pooled beneath him, black in the industrial lighting. He looked up at Lisa with eyes that held no remorse. Only calculation. Even now, he was measuring angles, plotting escapes. Lisa stood. The ghost rose with her, pressed against her leg, its breathing finally steady. The animal's eyes were clear amber now. Present. Aware. It looked at Marcus with recognition that went deeper than training. It knew. Somehow, through the chemical fog and neural damage, it knew who had poisoned it. Lisa, George said quietly. He stood 10 feet away, gun lowered but ready, his suit jacket torn, blood on his temple from earlier. Step back. This is my business now. She didn't move. No. It's mine. George's expression shifted. Not anger. Something closer to curiosity. Lisa walked toward Marcus, the ghost matching her stride. They moved as one unit now, synchronized in a way that made the remaining soldiers instinctively give ground. She stopped 3 feet from the kneeling traitor. You knew, she said. About my father's debt. About my past. George told you everything when he recruited me, didn't he? Marcus smiled through blood-stained teeth. He tells me everything. I'm his right hand. Were, Lisa corrected. She crouched down to his eye level. You knew I could control the ghost. That's why you accelerated the poisoning schedule. You needed it to break before I could stabilize it. Before George trusted me enough to listen. Smart girl, Marcus rasped. But not smart enough. You think stopping me changes anything? You think you're anything more than another tool in George's collection? He owns your father's debt. He owns you. Lisa's hand found the ghost's collar. The animal's muscles coiled beneath her touch. Tztkeh, she said softly. The ghost moved. Not in rage. In precision. It closed the distance to Marcus in one fluid motion, jaws locking around his throat. Not biting. Holding. The kind of hold that police dogs used for restraint. Enough pressure to immobilize. Enough control to remind everyone watching who truly commanded the weapon now. Marcus froze. The calculation drained from his eyes, replaced by primal terror. Lisa stood, leaving the ghost in position. She turned to George, who watched with that unreadable expression that had built empires and buried rivals. "You're right," she said. "You own my father's debt. $50,000. So here's my counteroffer." She walked toward him, her footsteps echoing off concrete. "You forgive the debt. Completely. And in exchange, I don't walk out of here with the only creature on earth that you couldn't control, but I can." George's jaw tightened. "That's extortion." "That's negotiation," Lisa corrected. "And we're not finished. I want a seat at your table. Not as an employee. As a partner. I handle the ghost. I handle any other animal security you need. And I get 20% of the profits from your exotic trade operations." One of George's soldiers laughed. The sound died when George raised his hand. "You're asking me to make you rich," George said quietly, "for doing what I could have you killed for refusing." Lisa smiled. It was the first time George had seen her smile, and it carried the same cold calculation he saw in his own mirror. "You could try," she said. "But the ghost follows me now. You saw it. Everyone saw it. The question isn't whether you can kill me. It's whether you can afford to." The warehouse held its breath. George stared at her for 10 seconds that felt like hours. Then he holstered his weapon. 15%, he said. 20. 17. And you train 2 more animals for me within the year. Lisa extended her hand. "Deal." George took it. His grip was iron. Hers was steel. "TZZT," Lisa said softly. The ghost released Marcus, who collapsed, gasping, clutching his throat. The animal padded back to Lisa's side, sat at attention, and looked up at her with devotion that had never been given to George Poche. Lisa C. Cologne had entered the obsidian room as a waitress drowning in debt. She walked out as the woman who tamed monsters and negotiated with demons. And the ghost walked beside her. Not as a weapon. As her choice. If you enjoyed this story and felt the tension, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel, and more Mafia stories are on the way.